We've invited each of you, Esau and Zena, to each share a little bit as we begin, up to 10 minutes each, though each of them claim that they are going to speak for less. We will be totally fine if you take your full 10 minutes. And then we'll turn to a conversation between the three of us, and then through the questions that all of you are able to submit, and that the Veritas staff will be kind of passing along to me. Our topic is joy, and I am really excited to have the two of you engaging with one another and this topic, because your books, your two recent books, actually are in a really interesting dance and tension with one another. Zena's book, Lost in Thought, makes an argument for, in a way, what used to be called, what still can be called, the contemplative life, as opposed to the active life, the life of attending to ultimate things for their own sake. Not for the sake of what she kind of broadly calls the world's values of wealth, status, and power, but interestingly and more complicatedly, not just for the sake of advancing justice or a kind of activism in the world. And then Esau's book attends to a particular set of texts, the texts of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, with an acute question of justice at its heart, born out of the Black experience in the United States, past and present. And yet, Zena's book ends up being suffused with attention to questions of justice, even though it's ostensibly arguing for a kind of reading that goes beyond a narrow concern with those things. Her figures like Malcolm X and Dorothy Day are people who entered fully into the pain of the world. And Esau's book, which begins with pain and indeed anger and rage as horizons of experience, keeps pointing beyond that experience, even in a way beyond the biblical text itself, to some horizon that's transcendent, that invites all of us in, and that outlasts even our most pressing immediate questions. And so to have you both angling in on this topic is an incredible gift to us this afternoon. So thank you for being here. We'll turn to you first, Esau, and let you speak and share, and then we will turn to Zena, and then we'll talk together about being witnesses to joy. Esau.
I told them this was a very interesting topic to give me witnesses to joy, because I would probably say that 2020 was probably the least joyful year of my life. And in order to do that, I need to put a little bit of stuff into context. So hopefully this doesn't feel self-indulgent. In the summer of 2020, sometime around the summer of 2020, through a variety of circumstances that maybe we'll get into later, I found myself like being invited to write a monthly column for the New York Times, which is something that I never thought about. And so for someone who is a writer, you might consider that the pinnacle of like accomplishment. And then I had a book that was released, this book, which when I signed the contract, this is for all you writers out there, they hoped that I would be able to like sell enough to make back my, am I allowed to tell what I got? I got $1,000 to write this book, nothing advanced. And so they hoped that maybe in the first year, it's a book on hermeneutics, to make back the advance. And all of a sudden I find myself with this best-selling book that actually won Book of the Year for Christianity Today. But at the same time that those two things were happening, my op-ed writing was taken off, and the book became wildly popular. My wife, who's in the military, deployed. So this happened in August. The book came out in September. I started writing the column in July. So right when those things happened, my wife is deployed, and she still isn't back. So the entirety of what's seen as an outwardly successful writing career has been with this deep sadness. So this person who I've known most of my adult life, who's been my partner, has been gone. And I've had 4 children with all the complexities of them having their mom gone during a pandemic, and me being the emotional center of not just their life, but also her life, because she needs to not feel like, a bad mother for abandoning her kids. And so I spent most of this year, while being outwardly seen as successful, but inwardly sad. I spent most of this year sad. And so one of the things that I would say, if there's a couple of things that at least I've learned from it, and I'll get to joy in a second, but you should hear this, especially for students. It is just simply a lie that outward success is sufficient to bring you joy. It's just a lie. I can tell you, like, I had all of the things that you want to have. And because the person who was most valuable to me was not there to rejoice with me, it felt empty. I would trade every book sold, except for the ones that Andy has, to have my wife back around with me. And so just like keep in mind that you can't eat success. You can't hug it. You can't spend time with it. It does nothing for you as far as joy. And to be honest, success has done nothing but complicate my life. Right now, my children are somewhere, hopefully not coming into this meeting. And so even doing events like this has been nothing but a complication. I'm happy to do it, but this is how I experience even the opportunity to speak. Otherwise, I'd be super excited to meet Andy and Zena, but now I'm just hoping that my children don't embarrass me. So the first thing that you could say that like external success doesn't bring you joy. So then you ask, well, then if external success doesn't bring you joy, like what does the Bible actually say about these things that do bring you joy? And the interesting thing that you see is on one level, the Bible frees us and to just rejoice in the various things that happen in our lives. Rejoice in your wife, rejoice in your children, rejoice in your youth. Like, so in the Old Testament, there's like the Bible that says, rejoice about the human experience. And so it's perfectly fine to like enjoy being young and not having your knees hurt when you wake up. That's completely fine. But at the center of the Bible, there's actually a couple of things where they said, this is what should bring you joy. And you see it over and over and over again when it's narrating the events of salvation. Rejoice for the Lord is king. Rejoice for the Lord is triumph. Rejoice because the Lord rescued me. And so what the Bible actually tells you to do, though, is to reflect upon the events in the life of what God is doing in the world and saying rejoice. And so part of what I've learned during this season, this actually has helped me. I don't always have external things that bring me joy. But it is true that sometimes in prayer, and when I'm reading the scriptures, and when I think about what God has done, I feel joy infused into me. It's not that I actually read the Bible and I work up joy. What I find is in the midst of a very difficult year for me, I've had these moments where joy interrupted me. It was funny because this morning, we just found out yesterday that my wife, who's supposed to come back in March, isn't coming back until May. So I was sad all day yesterday. But this morning I was listening to gospel music and all of a sudden I was just like praising God while I was brushing my teeth, listening to Kirk Franklin. And so I do feel like there's this sense in which even in the midst of really difficult circumstances, the truth of who God is like invades my spirit and I'm lifted towards joy. And so I would say that one way to find joy as a Christian is to actually reflect upon like the Christian story. The second thing is when I look at, and this is James 1:2 is the best way of talking about it. And this is across the New Testament. And they tell you to consider things joy, right? To consider it joy when you encounter trial, rejoice in suffering. Now, obviously the Bible doesn't think through a masochist, right? Like when someone's hitting you, you're saying, this is a wonderful experience that I'm being mistreated for being a Christian. But it's actually saying, when you are suffering and you recognize that your suffering is a part of what God is doing in the world. And in the midst of this suffering, God has not abandoned you, but this suffering is a part of a testimony that you will one day tell. You can consider it joy, right? So I can say, like, I understand, and this is kind of the Christian awareness, that I'm going through something that is trying me even to my edge. But the fact that I know that God hasn't abandoned me, and I know there's the other side of this story, even if it's in glory, where this becomes a part of my testimony, it allows you to experience the difficult things in life as joy. And so what I've just told you though, right? The fact that I just said, I am suffering right now, but I'm infused by joy is what God is using to testify to you about the possibility of joy. That's what I'm saying then is that one of the things that the Christian can do is wrap our suffering into a testimony. And the fact that our suffering isn't actually wasted, it's not just a pray for us, I'm not just suffering because the world is evil, is an opportunity to use to be something more. And this is the last thing that I'll say about joy. This is actually in John. So first thing, joy is found in the Christian story. Secondly, joy is found in suffering when we know that our suffering isn't wasted, but it's a part of what God is doing in the world. This is the last thing I'll say, and I don't know if I've been talking for 10 minutes or not, but this is in 1 John. John says that, what he has seen, what he's held, what he's touched, this is what he proclaims to his congregation. And he writes so that his joy might be complete. In other words, even though John has everything that he actually met Jesus, right? If anybody has an opportunity to have complete joy, he says, I have it. But John says that his joy is incomplete unless he shares what Jesus with other people. And so one of the ways that I think, especially as a writer, at least the joyous part for me as a writer, is this opportunity that I think in writing to usher people into the presence of God. And I don't know what it's like for you all, but like part of the writing experience is the playfulness of words. But every now and then you capture something in the writing, and when you write it, this is going to help someone be a better Christian. And the fact that I'm giving Jesus to someone else actually is the source of my joy. And so part of finding joy in the midst of suffering and difficult times actually comes in giving Jesus away, giving Jesus to other people through the gifts that God has given you. So I say 3 things about joy then to kind of wrap them up. First, joy comes in remembering what God is doing in the world, recounting that story. It infuses the Christian life with joy. We can consider our suffering joy because it's not wasted. It's wrapped up into the wider testimony of what Jesus is doing in the world. And finally, joy for the Christian is actually found in giving Jesus away through the gifts that God has given us, because we know what Jesus has done for us and what it might mean for other people.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you.
Well,
Zena, without further ado, please share your perspective with us.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure to hear Esau talk about his experiences this past year, because I also had a book come out this past year. It's also enjoyed success that was unexpected in many ways, and is objectively, I think, wonderful for me and for others. But it's a terrible year. And it's terrible in one's own life, whatever one's circumstances, and it's terrible to be a part of a community where so many people are suffering in so many different ways, and to suffer under the anxiety of not quite knowing what the future is and what's all coming out at the end of this. And so it's just, I can't tell you what it's like to hear someone in the same circumstances. And I just wanted to bring out a nuance to it, I think, for me. Someone asked me in a conversation a week ago, my book is very hard on the pursuit of power, the pursuit of status, the pursuit of honor. And here I am, I wrote this book about how bad the pursuit of status, honor is. And what do I get? I get money, honor, status, 6,000 Twitter followers, attention, more invitations I can handle. So how do I handle that? And part of what I think the gift of not quite fully being euphoric about it because of everything else that's going on in one's life, the gift of that is, it's a gift to know when you're in a circumstance like that, that the reason that you're doing it is for the message that you're sending. It's now my message is a little less, it's not, for me, it's giving Christ to others, but it's meant for a broader audience. So it's, teaching, learning, thinking, reading, studying, these things really matter. These are human goods. These are things which make people better. And that's why I wrote the book. That's why, and I have confidence that the popularity is its connection with that material, with that reality, the human reality that's behind what I'm talking about, not me. So, I think it's a bit of a commonplace in spiritual talk, right? That we're meant to be like windows through which some light shines. We're supposed to disappear, and we're helping people see through to something else. And honestly, I think that pain or frustration or feeling overwhelmed, it's a sign that that something is going right. Because if I were euphoric, if I were just rolling on the top of the world, that would be a sign to me that what I really cared about was, how many Twitter followers and how many invitations and how much money I had, how much status I had, and so on. So that was just one point I wanted to bring out, that sometimes the suffering is itself a gift because it's a sign that you're that you're doing the right thing.
I'm sorry, you excited me already.
You have to let me finish. So, and you get also unexpected, plain old ordinary joys, like you go to your 100th Zoom event in however many weeks, and these great people turn out to be here who you can talk to about the stuff you really care about. So that stuff happens too. It's not all a grind, guys. You get to talk to people like Andy and Esau. Okay, let me say a bit more substantively about what I wanted to say, and connected with my work about intellectual life, since we're also talking about reading and writing. And for me, writing is an outgrowth of intellectual life. It's an outgrowth of a set of activities for reading, studying, thinking about things, contemplating things, getting to know the world, encountering reality. Writing is a piece of that. Sometimes it's me working stuff out for myself, and sometimes it's me communicating, passing on to others something I've received. But it's, there's another embarrassment of mine is that pleasures is in the title of my book. Now, I fought with the publisher about that. I didn't want it in there, but there it was. And then the book is all about suffering. It's all about the suffering of the intellectual life. So how am I supposed to put that together? Well, so the suffering in question, the suffering of intellectual life, the suffering of a life of reading, writing, and studying is in part the suffering involved with a discipline of giving up distractions, giving up short-term gratification, giving up the sort of instant euphoria that leaves you feeling sicker later. All of that has to be given up, and it's painful. You can know it's the right thing to do, but it hurts. If you try to sit alone in a room like Pascal recommended, turn off all your devices, you are not going to like it. I'm not going to like it, and you're not going to like it. And that's pain. That's part of the suffering of intellectual life. And the other part is, you confront some piece of reality, and reality is not what you want it to be. It's not your fantasy of it. It's not how you imagined it. It's the real thing. On the other hand, I think in those moments when your wishful thinking collapses against reality, you find some truth that was not exactly what you thought it was. That can happen when you're reading a book. That can happen when you're thinking about politics. That can happen in your personal life. That can happen in all kinds of ways. But in that moment, for me, there's a bit of joy, a little fragment of joy that I am not in control of this, that the world does not go according to my will, that the world is not the way I imagine it, that I cannot have my own way. And that joy is a little glimpse of the fact that there is a God who is guiding my life, who knows better than I do what is good and what will bring me happiness. So that's I think a perfect example for me of the way in which there's a real cross in thinking and writing. It's a real cross. It can be, depending on what you're losing, it can be unbelievably painful to lose these illusions. But when you feel that reality past you, you know there's more. And with experience and practice, you learn to trust that and to take actual joy in it. So that's why I think okay, so here's another type of example. Let me just throw this in there. Some of the examples of the people in my book. So Irina Ratushinskaya is a Soviet political prisoner who was sent to Siberia and scratched out her poem, passed poems to the other prisoners and scratched out poems onto bars of soap until she'd memorized them and then washed them away and then wrote them out on cigarette paper and got them smuggled out. Now, is this a picture of a joyful life? Or is Malcolm X in prison reading the whole prison library? Is that a joyful life? I have a lot of prisoners. There's something about them that gets to me. But I think it's connected to this thing I'm talking about earlier, where that suffering that's coming at you from the outside, which can be severe. And now we're not talking about the suffering of collapse of wishful thinking. We're talking about physical deprivation. We're talking about torture. We're talking about uncertainty. We're talking about being diminished and demeaned and abused, all kinds of things. But even in that, these moments when these people find their dignity and reach into themselves and find how they matter, that too is a joy in the midst of a cross, the joy in the midst of suffering. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. I thought one last thing I wanted to say, and this is more getting back to the level of experience and how we're supposed to think about joy and our lives being joyful when things really don't feel that way. And now I'm thinking about Paul in Philippians telling us to rejoice always. And, you can read that and you can think, Paul, like, always? Give me a break. Like, no, I'm not going to rejoice always. The answer is no. On the other hand, I think what he goes on to talk about, what rejoicing always does, which is to consider it, it's the consideration of something as joyful as in the James passage Esau mentioned. What you get is the peace that surpasses all understanding, the peace of God that comes to rest in your heart. And in my experience, I just pass this on in case it's helpful to someone. Joy, don't always feel it, but peace, that's something that's sort of the experiential edge of joy that you can find in ordinary life, even in really rough circumstances. So if you're trying to discern, what's going on in a particular situation, why is God handing you some particular set of difficulties? What's the right thing to do? What's the right choice? Any spiritual advisor is going to tell you, look for peace. Look for peace. And hang on to that peace, and that peace is going to give you joy. I'm not going to be able to top that, so I'll end with that.
Wow. Thank you both so much. I want to queue up a couple things we could talk a little more about. I'll actually tell you what all three of them are, and some of them overlap with questions that people have already submitted, and please submit more questions as we go here. I want to talk a little more about the inner life that makes joy available to us, or makes it possible for joy to interrupt, infuse, invade. Those are all words you used, Esau, that I thought were really interesting. Then I'd love to talk about the outer work of writing and what our kind of responsibility is. And then I want to get to not joy in the midst of acute suffering, but in the midst of just blah, gray, dull, Groundhog Day depression. I want to make sure we get there. But if we could start with, what are the inner practices or things you've learned that make you available for those little moments of joy that you mentioned, Zena, even when something is having to be relinquished, and yet you feel kind of a lightness there. What can we start practicing? If you're 20 years old, what do you start doing in order to become the kind of person who has that experience a few years later?
So am I supposed to start? So I don't think that there's so I'm very leery of programs, sort of, 10 steps to save your life. So, the obvious thing to say for any kind of believer, right, is a practice of prayer.
Yeah.
So you have to practice prayer. You have to practice a bit of silence, and you have to practice some leisure. You have to do some things which are not for the sake of something else, but are just, walk in the park, read poetry, whatever it is that is your particular form of leisure. Look at birds. So those are the practices. What I'll say that I think I've learned myself in my experience is that routines have never worked for me. Every 6 months I say, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to have a new routine. Everything's going to be different now. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to be like a super person. And then it always lasts a week or two and then it's gone. So what does really help me, what has made my life bearable despite that, is that the more experience you have of those deep things, the more experience you have of prayer, of endurance, perseverance, of leisure, of really serious intellectual engagement of the kind I'm interested in, the more experience you have of that, you have a little marker in yourself of what that's like, and you want it.
Yeah.
And that desire is a huge engine for you to get back to that place. So it can be a long while. You may not be in control of when it happens. You have to live with that, but you want to be cultivating that pleasure, that desire, that joy of being in those spaces. And over time, with experience, you're sort of strengthening that muscle, and you know where it is. You may not be able to get there, but you know where it is. And when the door opens, you'll be able to go there.
Wow.
The great thing about this, and this should encourage you all, because there's not one type of person. So there's not one type of path to find joy. So I'm going to say the opposite of what Zena said. Because I became an Anglican. I grew up in the Free Church Baptist tradition. And for me, it was actually because I tend to be a chaotic person. I needed something outside of myself to bring some order to my own life. So I don't like the idea of just opening the Bible and thinking, what should I read today? This fills me with anxiety. So even when I'm actually a bad Anglican, I know that which I'm being a bad version of. And so for me, having like the daily office and the liturgical year, it's not for everybody. I'm saying for this Christian, I found that structure helpful for me. And the thing that I found about it is not that I actually encountered God in some miraculous way every time I did it, but the very monotony of the liturgy was itself unpredictable, because I never knew what part or what reading or what, like, so it's almost like within the very structure, it felt like God stuck into those places. And so the fact that I could just show up every day without an expectation, but being surprised by joy, is probably the better way of talking about it. So I would say that's one thing. And the other thing, and this is where me and Zena were close together, you should like find things in your life that are just joyful for their own sake. And I found that I've had to like adjust that in my own life, because to be honest, what became my op-ed career was me writing for joy. So I get paid to do New Testament scholarship. And so I would work all day and I would have to do boring, Greek and Hebrew. And so I would get home and I write about stuff that I actually cared like that was going on in the world. And then people started reading it and then it became a job. So now I'm actually paid to do what used to be my hobby. And I'm even you all about what is actually my hobby. And so now I'm actually been this year, I've been working on a children's book, because it was another place where it was a different kind of writing and the pressure wasn't there. So I found even ways as a writer to do different kinds of writing that give me that feeling of exploration and joy. Because even writing itself, all of it, anything that you do professionally eventually becomes work. And work brings responsibility. And so I found ways to make even the thing that now is a part of my vocation. Find ways of write, like remember like what it was like to like write a path. You know what I mean? Like the playfulness of it. And so I would encourage you to find ways to not allow that thing that was once a source of joy merely work. Writing in the intellectual life an adventure.
I have to step in just to point out that we are opposites in more than one way, because if I love working on the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. That's just like, I just relax. I'm so happy. I have to, whereas if I have to write for something public, I'm like, oh, I guess I got to do this.
Let me be clear before Wheaton gets mad at me. I enjoy the Bible. What I'm saying is, biblical studies has like, there's rules to it. And like structure. And so it's when you're doing free expression where I can bring in, I can just do more. So I feel I am more free as a writer when I'm not stuck with all of the rules of my discipline.
I almost put this in chat before we all got on the webinar. Dahlia Lithwick had this wonderful piece in Slate a couple years ago pointing out that the Muppets can be divided into two groups: chaos Muppets and order Muppets. And it's so, Oscar the Grouch is a chaos Muppet. Bert or Ernie is anyway, it works. And I thought, Esau and Zena are chaos Muppets. I can tell they are chaos Muppets. And you've now confirmed it.
Yes.
Let's turn outward to the work of writing a little more. We have two questions that hit on this. One person asked, do you have practical tips on how we might, to use your expression, Esau, give Jesus away through our writing? When you're writing, how are you aiming to do that? And then I think there's a really interesting parallel question from another student. How do we help others feel their suffering is not wasted if they don't know Jesus? In other words, they don't have access to the hope that we are grounded in. How do we offer, this is a beautiful phrase this student used, how do we offer pieces of Jesus even before they're ready to know or talk about Jesus? And it strikes me that both of you you're both writing in public as Christians. How do you translate the joy into an experience that people who may not be there yet can taste, imagine, see?
I'm so glad that you asked that, because I think that can be misheard when I talk about give Jesus away, as if my writing is a presentation of the gospel. Matter of fact, I've never written an article that at the end you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. So one of the interesting things for me, actually, let me say a couple of things about this. The first thing is I think that a Christian writer has to be fearless. In other words, there's different kinds of ways to write as a Christian. And sometimes we lower the stakes of the question so that Jesus has to do less work to be the answer, right? So the less evil the world is almost the less miraculous Jesus is. And so we can talk about things in a way that doesn't feel true to other people's experiences. And I felt like unless you can put your finger on the pain, people won't come with you.
Wow.
So one of the articles that I wrote that was a sentence that I wrote in an article that I didn't know that I believed until I wrote it is there is no other world to talk about than the world in which we live. There's no other world into which Jesus to come other than a world that sacrifices babies. It's actually about the slaughter of the innocent. Wow. And I said, there's no other world for Jesus to be incarnate. Now, I wrote that in the New York Times, but I was talking about what the world actually does to people. And so one of the things that I would say that you have to do, you have to be able to actually describe the lived experiences of people. And once you've described the actual world in which we live, not a Christianized version of it, then you could talk about spaces in which Christianity or what it means to be a Christian or whatever, the hope that you have speaks to it. And so I think that it's only with the real articulation of the darkness that light is actually visible. And sometimes I just read Christian writing that that you're not asking the question. And so what I want to say is that you have to be fearless, but that's dangerous because when I remember when I sat down to write Reading While Black, I had 7 questions that I wanted to have answered in the book, but I didn't have any of the answers. So I knew that if I wrote this entire positive book about Christianity and Black hope, I had to talk about slavery. And so when I sent, this is not how you should do it. When I sent out the thing, I was like, and the last chapter will be about slavery. Because I knew I had to put my finger on what Black people actually think about. How do I be a Christian? So I think that one thing that you can do as a Christian is that you can really be honest. And when I talk about that being dangerous is you don't know the answer. And that sends you on your knees. God, it's almost like a fiction writer kind of writes the protagonist into a corner, and then you got to write yourself out of it. And so I would say as a Christian, you got to write yourself into trouble all the time.
Wow.
And then trust that God will meet you there. Now, when you talk about God meeting you there, then you just have to be honest about what you can and can't claim. And so I don't say if you become a Christian, maybe I should say this way. I'd rarely say to someone, if you become a Christian, then your problems go away. But what I did learn to write is to say, for the Christian, this is how I process this. So they see me thinking through a issue as a Christian, and that gives them a window into how we see the world, rather than saying Christianity solves the problem. I think this is me thinking Christianly. So I would say Christianity has to be dangerous, and it's about theological imagination. And I think a lot of Christian writing is a little bit afraid. And so my next book is on Christianity and slavery. And once again, I sent it to him and said, I want to write about this. Because this is the question, like, how can you believe in, and so I think that fearlessness is an important thing for a writer. So sorry if that was too long, but that's how I have tried to do it.
It's fine because this is actually a moment where I think you were taking words out of my mouth, only saying them better. But I agree with that 100%. Honesty, embrace the darkness, talk from the dark point, and expose your own ignorance, vulnerability. I mean, that's kind of the secret to life. I mean, it's a terrible secret because it's so hard, and but any encounter with another human being, if you're not making yourself vulnerable, probably not much is going to come out of it. So now the one thing I would add, and this is a bit of the the Catholic tradition that inspires me, just the words I would put on part of what Esau said is grace builds on nature. So the human goods, the things that are good for human beings, which everyone can recognize in their own experience, there's a lot of richness in there, and you can talk about that all day and all night, and you don't even necessarily, I mean, I think it's important to be open about who you are and why you're saying what you're saying, but God's going to find his way through that. God works through what's good for human beings. That's why we give food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty, right? Because God works through those things. It's not because they're like means to an end. So that's all I would add. But that's just, yeah.
Can I say one more thing about the end? This is important for me. So when the question on slavery, and I said I had to write it, didn't know the answer, and you should at least follow this for 30 seconds. I'm reading Across the Lynching Tree, and James Cone quotes a guy named Pennington, and he quotes the first part of it that's asking about what does Christianity say about slavery? If this isn't, if the God does this, I will need another God, another hope. And he quotes it. But then James moves on, and he never gives Pennington's answer. So I said to myself, I wonder what Pennington actually says to the question. So I then go and find the article. And the article was the best articulation of, and this from an escaped slave, about how he reconciles Christianity and slavery. So then the title of the chapter in my book, called The Freedom of the Slaves, Pennington's Triumph. The chapter actually follows Pennington at different points. I quote him, but what I want you to understand is I didn't know the answer to the question. And it was James who took me to Pennington, who I went back to the source, and it opens up, and that's the intellectual journey. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is it. And so I feel like when we ask the question that the world is answering, and we trust that there's a good God out there, that there's an answer to the question, or at least there's a mystery that we can at least articulate, then I think we're actually doing important Christian work versus just like, I think that a lot of people are frustrated when they hear an articulation of Christianity or the world, and they go, I'm not that isn't my life. Like, I'm not that happy. I'm not that put together. I don't feel my triumph coming around the corner. They just kind of go, no. When you say, isn't it horrible? There's a lot of people say, yeah, it is. Sorry.
I just want to add in the thread that's also been running through our remarks, right, about the Bible, that, you look at the Hebrew Bible, it's Job and Ecclesiastes and parts of Genesis. It is raw.
It's a tragedy.
I mean, it is not. And we have to take that seriously and not try to explain it away, not try to allegorize it all out of existence, and say to ourselves, this is how the inspired authors of Scripture wrote things down, and they were thinking just along these lines, that we need to be able to recognize our life in the world that God's made.
I have to be very careful because I want to make sure that I respect like the Hebrew Scriptures and the way they articulate themselves. But I want to say that the Old Testament and the New Testament, Old Testament in particular, functions as a tragedy in the sense that the people there are always messing up, and it's just it's tragedies interfused by the goodness of God that like snatches souls from the fire. And so we have to take seriously like that story, that the story ends with Israel, even like the story ends like Israel is restored, but they're not yet free. And so how do you make sense of a story that like starts and goes this way, but interspersed by grace? And I think that that's like the human experience. That there is a tragedy interspersed by the grace of God in which he ultimately triumphs. And for the Christian, that means like the cross is the thing that snatches the entirety of this story from complete despair. But that's just like the human experience. Maybe I think that there's an advantage to being Black in America. Is that you just never believe the propaganda. We've always seen this for what it is.
Wow.
Like it's like we just see it.
Wow.
And so I think that like we've always had to, as a people, find ways to carve out spaces for joy in a world that's always trying to suck those things from us.
Wow. Oh my goodness, I have so many more questions and I so want to hang out longer, but I'm going to be the order Muppet and try to land the time and turn it back over to Peter in a moment. I just want to say there are many other questions that we didn't get to that people asked you. Thank you for all of you who sent them in. And several of them were actually about things like, how can I grow in my intellectual life? And I feel like you all have been modeling for us for the last little bit, all the elements of that. And what I'm hearing is, go deeper into reality, go to the unanswerable questions, take up your residence in the dark, and write and speak and learn in the dark if you have to. Enter into the tragedy of the story of God's people, of our own stories. It's just amazing how this conversation on joy has both been just continually referring back to the worst that can happen, some of pieces of which you all have tasted and shared a little glimpse of with us. And yet, the last 45 minutes to me have felt unbelievably full of joy, unbelievably full of hope. And I'm noticing that I've felt, even though I'm like the moderator and in charge and having to watch the clock, I have felt that peace that you talked about, Zena, as we allowed these things all to be kind of held together. So we could go on and on. We're not going to, darn it. But thank you so much. Thank you for who you are and for what you're offering to the world and for helping us be who we need to be and offer our own words and witness to joy to the world. Thank you, Esau and Zena.
I'm going to say one more thing because I get to
Chaos Muppet. Here it is.
I was just going to say thank you, but no, Esau's going to say more.
No. Like, don't rush. College students, I'm 40 years old. It's not old. It's old for you all. It won't be old for Andy. But it's
not
like,
old, brother. It's not old.
This book came out in my 40th year of life.
Yep.
And it's all of the things that I had to become the kind of person who can write this book.
Amen.
And the thing about the is that none of this is wasted. And you have to actually become the kind of person to do the kind of work that God has given you to do. And so one of the things that students are always asked, how do I do stuff? And I really praise God. I didn't receive any success in my 20s or 30s because I don't handle it. It wasn't until, I'm not sure I can handle it now. But one thing I would say is, how do you do it? Like, actually just like relax. Because we feel like we need to conquer the world, and the world is a big place. And we just got to become the kind of people who can do the work that God wants us to do.